no chance of escape. Next thing you know, cold steel in your face. Your pain and torment fate is in our hands. Deliverance of pain upon the stroke of our knives. Predatory impulses controlling our minds. You make a song, you'll end your fucking life.
Death metal.
A push for time. Can you sum it up in a word?
No.
The sound? Spartacus, thank you.
Death metal is the subgenre that I think most normies think of when they think of metal. Growling vocals, lyrics about gore, and music played at an inhuman pace. I take it we're all familiar with Florida Man. Well, Florida Man invented death metal. This particular Florida Man went by the name of Chuck Schildinger, and I'll give you one guess as to what his band was called. Yep, that's right, Death. Death effectively took the sound of thrash and set out to make it even faster and heavier, and began utilising more guttural vocals. At this point, the music was so heavy that regular singing just didn't sound right anymore. The earliest version of the death growl was done by the band Possessed in their 1985 album Seven Churches. Possessed were also very influential in the sound of death metal as a whole, and in fact on that same album they had a song called Death Metal. And this song, which shared the name of their demo tape, combined with the relative popularity of death in the underground scene, properly cemented the name for this subgenre. Some people argue that the name was purely a result of Possessed, but I think it was a combination of both. The screaming on Seven Churches, combined with the pioneering efforts of Chuck Schildinger's vocals in Death, and Max Cavalera's black metal influenced vocals in Sepultura, the death growl was gradually developed into what we would recognise today. Before long, the death growl was adopted by their imitators and quickly became the standard for death metal. That's right, the dreaded Cookie Monster voice that turns off so many newcomers first appeared in the 80s. The Florida death metal scene was underground, but undeniably popular by metal standards, and by the time the 90s rolled around, the biggest thrash bands were still finding some success, but in the American metal underground, death metal had almost completely replaced thrash. The way metal history tends to work is that people find heavy music that they like, but after a while they get too used to it and need something heavier to get their fix. It's exactly like spicy food. What did you think I was gonna say? The sound of death metal has the essential elements of the aforementioned growls, down-tuned guitars, which involves loosening all the strings to make every note lower, double bass pedals synced with said guitars, and of course, blast beats. A blast beat is a drumming technique where you hit the snare drum and a cymbal really quickly. Black metal had pioneered this technique, but oh boy did those Florida men love some blast beats. Notable Florida death metal bands include Death, obviously, Obituary, Morbid Angel, Deicide, Suffocation, and of course the infamous Cannibal Corpse. Some of these bands get sectioned off as brutal death metal, and I can understand why, as some are definitely heavier than others, and Cannibal Corpse were among the heaviest of the Florida death metal scene. Some death metal bands, especially Death, tried to have some meaningful lyrics and themes beyond senseless violence, but Cannibal Corpse were quick to realise that you don't actually need any of that. They went all in with the gore and made their lyrics as disgusting as humanly possible. If black metal is like a scary, atmospheric horror film, then this style of death metal is like a slasher film. Not particularly scary and very stupid, but gory and fun. It's fair to say that a lot of these bands were very tongue-in-cheek and don't take themselves too seriously. This is precisely why Cannibal Corpse were more than willing to appear in Ace Ventura. The vocalist of Cannibal Corpse, Chris Barnes, managed to develop a growl that ceased to sound human. and it probably would have been remembered as one of the greatest growls of all time had he been able to keep it up. But once he left Cannibal Corpse to be replaced by George Corpse Grinder Fisher and formed the now infamous 6 Feet Under, his vocals grew quite poor to say the least. At this point, Chris Barnes is pretty much the punching bag of the online metal community. And you know what? He certainly isn't helping his case by getting angry at better musicians for using the same song title he did 20 years ago. George Fisher is notable for 2 things. One, he popularised the windmill headbanging technique. This really only works if you have long hair like he does. He's also notable for having the thickest neck in the fucking world.
Damn, boy, he's thick! Boy, that's a thick ass boy! Damn!
And you know what? It probably is at least somewhat related to his constant windmilling. Death metal has been going strong ever since and is particularly popular in Sweden, which had its own death metal scene that ran parallel with Florida's. Some bands from the 80s Swedish scene include Entombed and In Flames, but Sweden never stopped producing death metal when Florida did, and as a result, Sweden has become the country associated with death metal the same way that Norway is associated with black metal. Death metal has many self-explanatory variations, and for such a maligned, noisy subgenre, it's actually very diverse in terms of style, especially progressive death metal, but we'll get to that. Technical death metal is extremely fast, and tends to feature some of the best drumming you'll hear in all music. Technical death metal is a very loose term, and it seems to cover everything from Gojira to cattle decapitation. Melodic death metal adds some proper melody to the riffs, and even though the vocals are still growling, they can have some catchy choruses. Some of the best known melodic death metal bands, all of whom are from Sweden, would be At the Gates, Arch Enemy, who are famous for featuring female vocalists and not paying their fucking photographers, and Amon Amarth. The latter are probably one of the best examples of what melodic death metal is, but people often forget this because they're mainly known as the Viking metal band. Even though there are other Viking metal bands, you can't top Amon Amarth. If you ask me, the biggest missed opportunity in the entire MCU was never using a single one of their tracks in one of the Thor movies. Brutal death metal, or extreme death metal, is just heavier, more excessive death metal. There's also slam metal, which is a slowed down iteration of brutal death metal, with heavy chugging riffs, almost black metal tier production, and a gurgling vocal style. It's about as monotone as extreme vocals get. Slam metal is knowingly silly, and the best way to describe it is that slam is what people who don't know a lot about death metal think death metal sounds like. It's borderline parody. Like, they literally just do grunts and pig squeals. Most of the time they don't even attempt to pronounce the lyrics. They literally just make the lyrics up after recording because you can't tell them that's not what they're saying. Slam metal is infamously even worse than black metal for having utterly incomprehensible band logos. Well-known slam bands include Abominable Putridity, Ingested, and Devourment. I've listed them because they're the only ones whose names I can actually fucking read. At pretty much the same time the Floridian and Swedish death metal scenes were happening, England was at it again with the Grindcore scene. Now, most grindcore bands can be categorised as death metal, but not the other way round. Just think of it as a variation of death metal. Grindcore and death metal are very similar, but with a few key differences. For one, grindcore has more of an emphasis on speed, and for another, grindcore vocals are less growling and more screaming and shouting. Grindcore got the core part of its name because they had a bit of a hardcore punk influence. And they got the grind part of their name from, I'm fairly sure it refers to the grinding away the guitar pick that most of the bands did, because grindcore is pretty much the fastest subgenre. The blast beats were even more intense and the songs were ridiculously short. The most famous example of this is You Suffer by Napalm Death, which is barely 1 second long. They actually won a Guinness World Record for world's shortest song, although I'm pretty sure with the number of grindcore bands that exist it's almost certainly been topped by now. It takes more time for the drummer to hit his sticks together than it does to finish the actual song.
Oh, it's an epic, that one.
Now, the Birmingham boys Napalm Death aren't the only notable band from this subgenre. Others include Carcass, whose gimmick was their use of a medical dictionary for writing lyrics, Pig Destroyer, Brutal Truth, Extreme Noise Terror, and the infamous piss take known as Anal Cunt. Anal Cunt were pretty much just trying to be as offensive as they possibly could. They were a lot like a pizza cutter, all edge and no point. Their music is kind of awful, but I would still recommend that you scroll through their Spotify page and just read some of the song titles. If you have a dark sense of humour, you'll have a good time. Before we move on, I'd like to make a wee note about the band Carcass. For one, they did start out as a grindcore band, but their sound evolved to be more general death metal later in their career. In the early days of the grindcore scene, Carcass used gruesome autopsy photos for album covers, along with using a medical dictionary as a thesaurus to write utterly disgusting lyrics. Just about every other grindcore band had very political lyrics, which was partly related to the punk influence, and their politics were often more overt than thrash. Carcass, on the severed hand, really just wrote songs about gore, and inspired the subgenre of gore grind. It's pretty much identical to grindcore, except instead of being about politics, it's about dead bodies. You'd be surprised how many songs you can get out of such a narrow subject matter. Imagine the level of centrism that's required to prefer to write about maggot-ridden corpses than confront any systemic problems. Porno grind follows the same idea. Grindcore, but about porn, I guess? And also the songs always start with a porn sample rather than a political sample. I don't fucking know. It's a meme subgenre, really. It exists for the meme. And I think that'll do for part 3. Join me for part 4, in which we'll look at groove metal.